In 2005, a tranquil American town was rocked by a harrowing event. A young woman vanished without a trace from her own home, leaving behind her belongings, phone, and car. Over time, the investigation of this matter began to resemble a typical detective series, with one key difference: all of this unfolded in real life. The small town plunged into fear and mistrust, as any of its residents could have been involved in the girl's disappearance. Only after 12 years would the world learn the dreadful truth. Tara Greenstead was born in 1974 in the town of Hogansville, USA. During her school years, she actively participated in beauty contests and consistently secured top positions. From an early age, she set herself the goal of acquiring a quality education. Thus, the money she earned from competitions was set aside for tuition fees. After college, Tara obtained a master's degree in pedagogical sciences and secured a position she had always dreamed of. She became a history teacher at a middle school in the town of Othello, in the state of Georgia. This tiny town represented a typical multi-layered America, with a population not exceeding 4,000, most of whom were well acquainted with each other. Life there unfolded quietly and steadily. None of the local residents could imagine that any serious crime could occur in Othello. Tara Greenstead worked at the local school for several years, during which time she developed excellent relationships with both her colleagues and students. She was a kind and sociable person who would always lend support and assistance. In October 2005, Tara's assistance proved invaluable to her students who were preparing to participate in a local beauty contest. Considering the fact that their teacher had repeatedly excelled in similar events, the girls were delighted with her support. On Saturday, October 22nd, Tara helped her students with the final touches before the contest. Afterwards, she went on a picnic with her school friends and returned home only at 11 p.m., parking her car outside as usual. Since then, Tara ceased to be in contact. Her mother, who lived in another town, was the most worried of all. Her daughter always answered the phone or called back, but this time she never received a response. On Monday, October 24th, the concern reached its peak. Tara didn't show up for work. Such behavior was extremely unusual for her, as she took her job seriously and would have informed her superiors if she needed a day off. Concerned acquaintances of Tara contacted the police chief, Billy Hancock, and asked him to check if everything was all right with her. At 10 a.m. that same day, he headed to her address. The policeman believed that the woman's phone had simply run out of battery, and she either fell ill or overslept. Upon arrival at her home, he found Tara's car in its usual spot. Its doors were unlocked, but this didn't surprise Billy. In such a small town, residents weren't concerned that their cars might be stolen. Afterward, he noticed an envelope with $100 in cash on the dashboard. This was already peculiar. How could such a responsible person as Tara leave money in such an exposed place? Billy knocked on the door, but no one answered. After that, he decided to inspect the house. At first glance, everything seemed entirely ordinary. No signs of struggle or break-ins, but in Tara's bedroom, detectives found a real mess, completely uncharacteristic of a woman. Her belongings were strewn across the floor, including the clothes she wore last. The mobile phone was on the nightstand, charging. Everything seemed as if Tara had briefly left the house, but she was nowhere to be found. Near the house on the ground, the police found the first clue that led them to consider the possibility of a crime. There lay a latex glove, which someone could have used to conceal fingerprints. Detectives did not consider the version that the glove could have belonged to Tara herself. Such items were practically unused in everyday life. Since then, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, a state-level equivalent of the FBI, has been involved in the case. The primary hypothesis of the investigation was abduction, as there were very few clues. In addition to the glove, detectives identified two other dubious factors. Tara's broken necklace was lying on the floor in her bedroom, and her alarm clock was not in its usual place. However, all of this did not help the detectives unravel the mystery of her disappearance. For the small town, this Monday truly became horrific. Tara's house was cordoned off, and a meeting was held at the school. Tara's colleagues and students tried every means to help in the search, forming a group of volunteers. They printed a stack of flyers with photos of the girl and information about her disappearance, and within hours, these leaflets were plastered all over the town. On that day, the volunteers did not disperse until 1 o'clock in the morning. Bureau of Investigation agents interviewed Tara's neighbors and scrutinized the area in which she resided. Dogs trained in tracking participated in the search, brought in hopes of picking up the missing woman's trail. Investigators still held hope that Tara had simply gone somewhere on foot and that the dogs would easily find her. At the same time, the latex glove was handed over to experts, whose aim was to gather the maximum amount of data. They managed to obtain a DNA sample. However, no matches were found in the FBI database. It was only known that the sample belonged to a man. Alas, all of this yielded no results. Tara seemed to have evaporated from her own home. Then investigators began delving into her personal life and past. It often happens that someone from the inner circle is responsible for a girl's disappearance or death. After studying the men Tara had been involved with, detectives could not single out any suspects. She had been in a longer relationship with Marcus Harper, a former policeman and military man. The couple parted ways at Tara's initiative about a year before her disappearance. The reason was that she wanted to start a family, while Marcus was not ready for that. After their breakup, they maintained friendly relations, calling and messaging each other. Later, detectives uncovered an interesting detail. Marcus had visited Otsilo 3 weeks before Tara's disappearance, but he hadn't informed her about it. Upon learning about Marcus's visit from mutual acquaintances, the girl was greatly upset. She repeatedly called him, trying to find out why he hadn't informed her of his arrival. Soon, Tara's condition escalated into a full-blown hysteria. Her relatives were deeply concerned and even inquired whether Tara might be contemplating something reckless. However, she soon regained composure, so the police did not consider Marcus a suspect. The couple had been together for a long time, but their relationship ended, and detectives couldn't find any motives for the crime. An interesting turn awaited them soon. The police learned that Tara had been threatened by her own student. On March 30, 2005, 7 months before the girl's disappearance, he came to her house and behaved extremely aggressively. When Tara refused to let him in, the young man began to pound on the door, and the neighbors had to call the police. It turned out that the boy had been in love with his teacher since school. According to her acquaintances, the former student was emotionally unstable, behaved strangely, and even menacingly. For a while, Tara tried to help him sort himself out, but his mental state only worsened. After that incident, when the boy tried to break into her house, Tara filed a report against him. She seriously feared that he might harm her. After Tara's disappearance, the police attempted to trace the young man. He worked in a neighboring town 150 kilometers from Otsilo. The boy provided alibis to the detectives for the night of his former teacher's disappearance, but they couldn't establish his involvement in the case. In the woman's house, they also found the business card of a certain police officer. It turned out that Tara had been seeing him for some time, but at the time of her disappearance, he was already living in another town. The police officer also provided an alibi for the night of Tara's disappearance. That was essentially the end of the list of possible suspects. With no leads in hand, the police decided to organize the search for the girl 2 weeks after her disappearance. Such a delayed decision seemed strange, as it was clear from the first moments that Tara had left home against her will. Hundreds of volunteers were mobilized for the search, combing through the surroundings of Otsilo, scouring forests, canals, and rivers, but they failed to find any trace of Tara. During the search, a report came in that a house and car had burned down not far from Tara's residence. The local residents unanimously concurred that this incident was somehow connected to Tara's disappearance. Perhaps the perpetrator decided to cover their tracks, or were people so shocked and frightened that every event seemed suspicious to them. Be that as it may, the searches yielded no results, and the police were confronted with the grim reality that they simply had no leads. The subsequent years did not bring the police any closer to unraveling this mystery in the slightest. It wasn't until 2009 that an event occurred, once again drawing attention to Tara Greenstead's disappearance. An individual user created a channel on YouTube and uploaded an extremely horrifying video. In the footage, a man was seated, his face obscured, and his voice altered. In the video, He claimed involvement in the disappearances of 16 girls, naming them. Among them was Tara Greenstead. The unknown individual added that he had securely hidden the bodies and would provide clues to their locations in new videos. The police immediately investigated the video and found that all 16 names indeed belonged to the list of missing women. The FBI managed to track down the author of this video fairly quickly, a 27-year-old named Andrew Haley. After his arrest, he claimed that he had simply intended it as a joke. The police couldn't establish Andrew's involvement with any of the 16 girls, but he couldn't escape trial nonetheless. For presenting false testimony and falsifying evidence, the man was sentenced to 2 years of forced labor and a probation period of 13 years. The fleeting hope for solving this cold case dimmed, and the police once again found themselves without a single lead. In December 2010, Tara Greenstead was officially declared deceased, as there was simply nothing to work with. Years went by, but the residents of Othello remembered Tara Greenstead's disappearance well. They remembered, but discussed it less and less. Conversations about Tara remained behind closed doors. This topic was hardly ever brought up in everyday life. The town had changed forever. Fear and mistrust permeated the locals for years to come. It wasn't until 2016 that something happened that once again compelled people to openly discuss Tara. Journalist Penn Lindsley from Atlanta launched a podcast dedicated to mysterious cases, and for the first episode, he took on Tara Greenstead's case. Together with his colleague, he went to Othello, where they met with private detective Morris Godwin. Together, they began to work on this case practically from scratch. They had no access to police documents, so the only available source of information was the town's residents. At first, they could only talk to Tara's relatives and friends. Strangers actively avoided discussing the missing girl, but that didn't last long. With his enthusiasm, Lindsley managed to reignite interest in the case, and soon the residents of Othello began to discuss Tara once again. Lindsley and Morris explored every possible lead. They considered 3 possible suspects: Tara's former boyfriends and the student who had tried to break into her house. Along the way, they spoke to anyone who might have had any information. They were so engrossed in this case that several times they felt that the solution was right under their noses. One day, Lindsley received a call. An unknown person suggested searching for remains on Tara's property. The police did just that. At one point, they managed to find bones, but experts quickly determined that these bones belonged to an animal. Despite the frenzy and the new wave of interest in this case, no significant progress was made, or rather, they failed to solve this case directly during the creation of the podcast. But it was precisely this amateur investigation that could have been decisive in the long-awaited resolution, and the resolution came about quite unexpectedly. In early 2017, a certain Brooke Sheridan came to the police. Her story shocked the detectives, who no longer believed that the truth would ever be revealed. Brooke told the investigators that her ex-boyfriend, a man named Buddy Yucks, had once confessed to her he had helped his friend dispose of Tara Greenstead's body. The young lady repeatedly implored her companion to confess everything, but he remained silent. After hearing Brooke's account, the police did not hasten events. Who knows, perhaps this woman sought fame and attention, especially when the successful podcast reignited discussion of the case. Detectives decided to act decisively. They asked Brooke to wear a wiretap and approach her ex-boyfriend to extract a confession. It worked. The man did not deny his involvement, and the police had grounds for arrest. To their surprise, he immediately began cooperating with the investigation and laid all his cards on the table. Later, detectives would say that Duke simply grew tired of carrying this burden on his soul. Late one evening, he received a call from a friend and former classmate, Ryan Duke. He asked to borrow a truck and help with something, then added, "I broke into Tara Greenstead's house to steal some money, but things didn't go as planned, and I killed her." According to Ryan's account, after a party with friends, he went for a drive. At that moment, under the influence of illicit substances, he decided to break into someone's house and steal money, choosing Tara's house. He managed to open the door with a credit card, entered the house, and began searching for money. Tara noticed him. A struggle ensued, from which only Ryan emerged alive. When Dukes arrived at the girl's house with the truck, they loaded the victim's body into it and drove to the woods. Then the two of them disposed of the body over the course of several days. This story shocked the residents of Otsilo. Dukes and Duke were never considered suspects, as they simply had no motive. There were no clues that could link these two to the woman's disappearance. Despite Bo Duke's full confession, he did not testify against himself. During the trial, he addressed Tara's relatives and begged for forgiveness for his actions. Duke spent a long time in the army, was a veteran, and had numerous awards, but the court rendered its decision: 25 years in prison for aiding in the concealment of abduction. As for Ryan Duke, his trial is still ongoing to this day, 4 years after his arrest. Much of this is due to lawyers using various loopholes to delay the inevitable. There is no doubt that prison awaits Ryan, but when the court will deliver its final verdict is unknown. Now that the truth about this sensational case has come to light, Tara Greenstead's friends and relatives have relieved themselves of the burden of uncertainty. Her mother confessed that all these years she secretly hoped for a miracle, that her daughter would return to her alive. Alas, reality proved to be cruel, senseless, and devoid of any miracles. At least now the whole world knows what happened in that small town back in 2005.